you're in the right place. This is the Eatfluencer Podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Maggie Landis. Together, we are going to unpack everything about eating and discover the what, when, and how that will let you lead your best life. This is not your doctor's conversation about nutrition. Today is when you can start to love eating again. Let food be food and you be you. Get ready to get eatfluenced. Hello there. Welcome back. This is Maggie at the Eatfluencer Podcast. I'm glad you've joined me today. This is episode 78, which I have titled, What is Bias and How is it Messing with Our Science? And I'm going to get into just a moment what exactly I mean by that and what exactly we're going to be talking about today. But I want to let you all know, first of all, welcome. If you're new here and this is the first time you've heard this podcast, then you've got a lot to catch up on because we are coming up on the end of season 2. I think I'm going to have 2 more episodes after this one, and then I'll be taking a little break because the Eatfluencer Podcast is going to get reformatted, rebranded over the summer, and when it comes back in its new form, if you like it now, you are going to seriously love it. It's going to be even more of the super awesome content that you like hearing, that I like talking about, specifically about weight stigma, about this sort of anti-fat narrative in the health professions, about the science of nutrition and why what we're hearing is not always the truth, like really leaning into that body of information that I see as my specialty. And I'm going to be presenting it with a little bit more fun, a little more humor, a little more snark. So I encourage you to stay tuned. And if you follow this podcast, it will, when it comes back with its new name and branding that I have not released to the public yet, it should just show up on your podcast player. I'm pretty sure how that works because I'm keeping the, what's it called, RSS feed the same. You know, I'll figure all the tech details out. Don't worry about that. But I don't want you to think I've left permanently. It's just going to be a little pause over the summer after the next couple of episodes to do that work. And in the meantime, this summer, you don't have to miss me. I'm going to be introducing a new monthly, what I'm calling conversational workshop series, because I don't want it to be lecture-y. It's not, grad school. It's not grand rounds. It is a conversation that we're having together. And I'm calling it Talk with the Doc. And I'm going to be bringing up the most important of the important issues that people always ask me as a doctor to explain to them. And it's going to be an interactive format where you can ask questions after some of the information's been presented so that when more questions come up, then you can ask more questions. And I want you to leave the session feeling like you have more answers than questions. Because I always hate going to those things where, they ask for pre-submitted questions, then you listen to the information, and then you have a question, but since you didn't pre-submit it, you don't get a chance to ask. I'm not doing that. I want people to get the information that they need. So I'm going to announce the first of that series of workshops next week. Make sure you're on my email list or tuned into my social media, and you will hear all those announcements. Okay, fabulous. So today's show. What is bias? How is it messing with our science? What we're talking about today is scientific bias and research bias. And the reason this is important is not because I think that all of you are in graduate school and studying research methodology, but it's important because having an awareness that everything you hear or see is not, guaranteed to be high quality, that everything is, sort of filtered through these different lenses of bias, and the more bias it contains, the further from the truth the information becomes. And I just want you to know that that's out there. I want you to know what some of these types of bias look like, sound like, smell like, so you identify them when you hear a headline, when your doctor tells you something, when your friend tells you something, when you see something linked on social media. Really, you don't need to understand detailed study design to be a savvy consumer of science. It's a real intellectual thing for people to toss around, well, studies show, or I read this, or, I've seen, or it's been shown, all this stuff. But, a lot of people saying that don't actually know anything about study design or research methodology and whether or not what, quote, studies show is actually showing anything, because they don't understand how to interpret results. And like I said, I don't expect the average person to do that. What I do expect from healthcare professionals, though, is to do that or be able to defer to somebody who can do that better, because, we just have this responsibility. If you are in a profession where you're wearing a white coat, and I mean that in a figurative sense, you may not actually wear a white coat, but if you are in a position of authority in the health professions, you're a dietitian, you're a physical therapist, you're a doctor, you're a chiropractor, you're a nurse practitioner, anything where a patient or client comes to you and believes absolutely, unquestioningly, what comes out of your mouth, you need to know that you are not reflecting more bias in the information. All right? I'm really encouraging everybody to be critical, is what it comes down to. And that extends to everybody. People who have real scientific integrity and are really interested in the truth and interested in the kind of evolution of research and science and information, they love conversation. They love people questioning things. They love being invited to offer proof and explanations and to, really scrutinize things, because that's how we learn. That's how we move forward. And if you are getting information from a person, a professional, a source that is not willing to support their assertions with high quality evidence, that usually means what they are saying is biased. I mean, really, it's a pretty scary proposition to think that there's people speaking almost completely out of their own personal biases and it is being consumed as science. But that is actually what is happening. And I hate saying that, but it's happening in doctors' offices and hospitals and clinics all over the world. But science evolves, people evolve, the practice of medicine evolves, our cultural awareness evolves, research methodology evolves. Everything improves over time when we become more discerning. And if they're unwilling to recognize that, big red flag. Big red flag. So anyway, let's get into this. Now, let me tell you what. I was so surprised, even in researching for this episode, the types of bias. And I've studied this before in graduate school, and I was just kind of refreshing my memory, making sure I had some of the language right before I, recorded this episode. But even in looking at stuff now, I found things I was not even aware of. There are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of cognitive and social bias and personal bias and bias in the qualitative science and bias in the quantitative science and da 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 da. Anyway, I'm not going to present all that because that is just too much and nobody wants to hear all that. But I'm going to introduce to you on a super, super high level, very superficial, kind of introductory level, the 10, what I would say are the biggest categories of bias that we see in this type of science that I talk about here. Health science, nutritional science, this sort of wellness, whatever. Wellness isn't science. Wellness is a social construct. But, I want you to know these things and just think of this when you hear the next commercial, when you see the next thing coming across your Instagram feed, when your, girlfriends are trying to sell you their MLM products, when you read a headline in a magazine or something. Is there good information out there? Absolutely, yes. I am by no means saying that everything is garbage. But unfortunately, garbage is one of the most prevalent things, especially in relationship to weight, health, BMI, body image, nutrition, eating, public health, all that sort of stuff. Bias is just baked into that. So let's define first what bias is. And I think you understand what that is. I mean, it's the tendency of thought that prevents unprejudiced consideration of information. All right. So basically, a notion, preconceived idea, belief system, way of thinking, method of observation that conflates things that aren't to be related to each other in a, it doesn't keep it clean. It's not clean research. It's not clean science. And then, of course, when you introduce bias in scientific research, through the way you conduct the questioning or the sample size or your, sort of analytic methods or the setup of the project or the funding or whatever, then you are going to magnify the kind of error or erroneous flavor of the results, because every step when you have then, a questionnaire that has bias built in, and then you give it to 10,000 people who you have selected in a biased way, and then the person who's publishing the analytics as biased when they, are doing their statistical analysis. Like, you can see how it becomes this, I don't even want to say comedy of errors, but really, yes, comedy of errors, like a bad game of telephone going from one end to the other. And us as consumers, reading the headline, scrolling social media, just listening to random information out there, we are at the end of that telephone game. And that's never a good place to be when, you're giving people advice that can make or break really some very critical aspects of their life and their health. So anyway, let's go through these. And I'm going to give you an example. So basically I have these 10 things. I have a definition of what it is, and I have an example of it in the nutrition science. And that's it. That's as deep as we're going today. This is not a research methodology class. You are not going to have a PhD at the end. All right. But let's get through this. So the first thing that I think everybody understands what it is, but they don't know necessarily the term for it, is confirmation bias. And this bias is when you look for things to support what you already believe. So you pick out information that supports your own personal hypothesis, and then you conclude that your hypothesis is true because you've only looked at the information that supports what you want to see. All right. Now, there's lots of examples of this. I mean, this may be even one of the most prevalent ones out of these 10 that I'm going to talk about. But a really obvious example to me is a lot of the studies that conclude weight loss diets, calorie restriction is beneficial, that management of body size is possible with what's on your plate at mealtime. That's what those researchers and people involved in those studies believe is going to happen. Before they even start, they believe that calorie restricting a group of people will make them smaller. Okay, that's what they expect. So they set up the study, they start doing whatever study, and it can be done in a number of ways. And yeah, in 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months, if you calorie restrict, you will probably shrink your body. And so then they stop. So what happens is the researchers stop and truncate the study. Like doing a 12 weeks, 20 weeks, 6 month, even year or two follow-up in a clinical study is nothing. Y'all, that is like nothing. That is a open and shut nothing. You know how fast that goes by? We're not looking for answers that last 12 weeks or 6 months or 2 years. I would like to know what happens in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, because that's how long I plan on living. So, basically the confirmation bias is that then they truncate the study when the result they're looking for is present and it's over. They don't see basically what would have happened if they continued the study. That people do gain the weight back, that people do develop disordered eating, that people do develop eating disorders, that people do have, mineral deficiencies, that people do lose muscle mass. They don't mention any of that because they have stopped where they saw the result they wanted. Okay. I'm going to have to move quicker. I told you I was going to do this quick, but y'all, if you've been listening to me, you know this. I can't stop talking. That's why I have a podcast. Okay. Number 2, observer bias. So this is when one person's cognitive bias reflects on their observation of someone else. All right. So, for example, here's a good one. Health professionals who have patients in their practice that are in large bodies, fat, obese, whatever word you want to use, and they're depressed, the assumption is made often by the health professional and reflected in the documentation sometimes that this individual is depressed because they don't like their fat body. When actually, that is a reflection of the observer's bias, that they don't like fat bodies, that they feel like they would be depressed if they were in a fat body, that, fat bodies are depressing, whatever way you want to spin it. When actually the person in the fat body who's depressed might be depressed because they are enduring weight stigma. They might be depressed because they're enduring verbal abuse in the workplace. They might be depressed because they have an undetected eating disorder. There's a lot of other reasons, but if the cursory assumption is that, oh, look at their body, A is because of B, that's observer bias when a third party like a doctor, researcher, scientist is assessing that on somebody else. Okay, number 3, recall bias. This is when information collected in a scientific methodology is skewed based on the participant's ability to even remember what happened in the past. Okay, the most clear form of recall bias is basically any type of study that is talking about food intake, eating behaviors, dietary tracking, that sort of stuff. That stuff is all self-reported. You do realize that. That's all like self-reported. The NHANES information, all that kind of stuff is by doing these questionnaires where they ask people questions like, how many times did you drink milk in the last 10 days? Okay, well, if you can even remember how much you might have drank in the last 10 days, do you remember exactly? I mean, or whether those 4-ounce cups, 8-ounce cups, 16-ounce cups, and we're talking like a week. So they ask questions. A lot of these are collected over the last, they ask people to reflect over the last year or more of time and say, over the last year, would you say you had green beans 1 time per week, 2 times per week, 3 times per week, 5 times per, that kind of stuff. And it's just so hard to even be remotely accurate in this. I mean, I can't even tell you what I'm recording this. It's like 7:00 at night. I couldn't even write down with any accuracy what I ate yesterday if I had a gun held to my head. I mean, I'm not kidding you. It is, people don't remember stuff. Which then leads us to the next one, the next type of bias, which is the social desirability bias, which means that respondents and participants answer questions in a way that they think will be favorable to the person conducting the study. Okay, so when I know that I am enrolled in a study talking about the benefits of green vegetables, and then one of the questions says, how many times in the last year did you eat green beans per week? My inclination would be to probably overestimate even my crummy ability to recall, because that is what is desirable for the research format. All right. And so people will sometimes inaccurately report things about personal behaviors, and this is, sensitive topics. We're talking weight loss, eating disorders, laxative abuse, things like that. People are not always willing to be open and be fully disclosed with behaviors and eating habits and stuff when they know that that's kind of, I'm putting air quotes, an unfavorable outcome, right? So this social desirability bias is a real thing. Okay, next. I don't know what number I'm on. I quit counting. One of you guys can count for me. Selection bias. All right. So selection bias is when certain groups, certain types of individuals are either overrepresented or underrepresented. And really, I mean, ideally, if you wanted to really know a scientific fact, you would want as many different people as possible contributing to that body of data. Okay. You would want, if you want to know what Americans ate yesterday, you want to ask 329 million Americans what they ate yesterday and get a, average or whatever. Like that would be the best possible way to do it. But obviously there are limitations in enrollment numbers and availability of subjects and length of follow-up and all sorts of things. So we do stuff, right? To kind of work around, and that's normal. And that is a, sort of normal procedure in scientific research. But what I'm getting at, the point is that every time you kind of close that fence in a little tighter, a little tighter, a little tighter around a group of people, you are discriminately selecting certain people. Okay. If enrollment for a study that's talking about, let's say, weight or weight loss or nutrition or something, if the enrollment is happening in a doctor's office in a major medical center, the people that are signing up to be in the study, in the investigation, are people that have shown up for their appointment in the doctor's office in the major medical center. Okay, see what I'm getting at? What about the people who don't go there because they ride the bus and they can't get to that location? What about the people who no-show their doctor's appointments because the last time they went, they were weight stigmatized? Or what about the people that aren't even making the appointments because they are working 3 jobs and they're single parents on a, little bitty income? You see what I'm saying? Is that when we select participants, we are biasing our data at every inclusion or exclusion step in the design. So anyway, that's just important to know that is involved too. And you really need to know where and who these people are that are supposedly showing this result. Okay, next. Cultural bias. Okay, this is pretty obvious. I mean, basically the dominant cultural belief system is identified as being kind of normal, quote normal, mainstream, stereotypical. And so anything that kind of bucks that norm a little bit, that is outlying or seems to be significantly different in comparison to the dominant narrative, can affect or influence the decisions and the way things are presented and written. So, for example, in our culture, the dominant narrative is that thin bodies are better, that they are healthier, they are more desirable, they are more attractive, they are more valuable, they're more productive. That's our cultural belief system. That's not my personal belief system, but that's our cultural belief system. And it's also a cultural belief that weight is a behavior that is in your control, and you control it by eating less and moving more. So when that's the belief system that we have been indoctrinated to from an age before we could even talk in complete sentences. Now, everything we've learned, everything we design, everything we report, that we write about, that we, monitor is seen through that cultural bias lens. Basically, this is a type of bias that you really, it's very hard to remove it, because you can't take cultural sort of standards or the cultural belief system out of a person. Like everybody has bias. And the person who says they're not biased about anything is exactly the person who's biased. So make sure about that too. But this cultural bias is there. So the goal is, not to necessarily eliminate it, because that's not even a possibility, but to definitely try to recognize it, minimize it, bring in diverse other opinions to sort of neutralize that dominant narrative. That's important. Okay, next. Funding bias. All right. I don't have to tell you that doing research, scientific, investigation costs money, costs a lot of money. And money talks in this discipline, all right? Money determines what studies are funded, what is allowed to happen, what doesn't happen, how big they get, how fast they get done. Money influences where studies get published, where, if they're published, they get presented, who presents it. Like the diet, culture, and food industry, weight loss industry, they have money. They have more money than just about any other singular industry. So they have like major skin in this game. Okay, people like me, I have no money. Okay, really, truly, I have no money. And very few individuals, very few cultural change makers, very few activists and advocates who are telling you not to do something. Okay, you have to understand, their diet culture, the weight loss industry, the food industry, they're telling you to do something. They're saying, buy our product, hire our coach, drink our shake, take our pill, have our surgery, wear this, waist trainer, whatever it is. People like me, we're encouraging you to do nothing. We're saying, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. You can trust yourself. You don't need any external advice, device, app, coach, thing. You don't need anything. Well, that doesn't make anybody else any money. There's no secondary financial gain for somebody to support me in doing a study so that we can publish a study showing a bunch of people not to do something. All right, so you can see how this is a super kind of tilted thing. And so what happens is the body of information, like the bulk of information, is produced by the people with the deepest pockets. And that's not right. That's not the scientific method, but that is the reality. So you always need to always know who is funding this, where it's coming from, who are the people involved, who is the industry involved. It's critical to knowing whether that's information you can trust or not. Okay? Next. Well, let's just go here. Publishing bias. This is related and unrelated to what I just say, but basically a study, here's how the scientific method works, okay? You come up with a hypothesis and you say, I think A causes B. And then there's what's called a null hypothesis, which means there is no more chance that A causes B than there is just a statistical anomaly. Like it's random chance that would happen. There's no causative relationship. So then you do your study and you're either accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. Okay, that's all nerd talk. But if you do a study and the finding is negative, okay, and I don't mean negative like, eating sugar makes you have diabetes and that's negative. What I mean is you have a hypothesis that something is going to happen and then it doesn't happen. Okay, those types of studies are way less likely to get published than a study that shows a result. So a statistically significant result is more likely to get published than a not statistically significant result. Even though disproving something by not proving it, see how that gets complicated? We're not really disproving it, but we're not proving it. Anyhow, the bottom line is there's a lot of garbage out there, and there's a lot of stuff sort of missing. You have to remember what you're seeing in print, in headlines, is the stuff that was funded, that was supported, that was published, that was selected. I mean, there's just bias on top of bias, like a big bias sandwich, all right? Okay, here's another thing. Fundamental attribution error. This sounds really fancy, but we all do this. We do this in our daily lives. And basically, this bias refers to a person believing that somebody else's behavior is based on a, sort of negative action that's usually grounded in a biased stereotype, while you believe that your behavior is for some completely other reason. Like, well, for that person, if a fat person has diabetes, then obviously they eat too much sugar and fast food. But if a thin person has diabetes, they must have gotten it from their great-grandmother in genetics. Okay? That is like, I'm trying to think of another good example, but assuming that, this person is overweight and they're 30 years old, that must be because they drive through Dunkin' Donuts all the time. And me, I'm 45 years old and I'm overweight. That's because I'm in menopause, and assuming that, either of those is even true is ridiculous. But the fact that there would be different reasoning based on somebody's behavior, based on a stereotype. Okay. All right. And then here, we're almost at the end. This is my last one. If you're counting, this should be number 10, but this is possibly my favorite one. And I don't know so much if it's my favorite one because it is my favorite one, or if it's my favorite one because I think that they mention it several times on Big Bang Theory, and I'm like a big fan of that show. The Dunning-Kruger effect. All right. Are you laughing? You must be a Big Bang Theory lover too. But okay, here's the deal. This Dunning-Kruger effect describes a bias where people assume that an event is extremely simple because their understanding of it is very simple or basic. So, said another way, the less you know, then you assume everything is less complicated. And the problem with this is it really limits progress, because questioning things, looking for complexities in things, asking that next question is what propels science forward. And when we collectively, as a group of scientists, think that something is done being explained because it seems so simple, it must be the end of the answer, that is really dangerous. That is really closed-minded, and that is really harmful. And here is the best example I can think of. Calories in, calories out. Eat less, move more. All right, this is the quintessential example. Maybe that's why this is my favorite, is that the belief is that if you eat more calories, you will gain weight. If you eat less calories, you will lose weight. And not only is that believed to be true, it's believed to be true in this like super simplistic linear fashion. That's why we have little calorie trackers on our Apple Watch and on the treadmill at the gym. And that's why there's calorie labels on your cereal box and on the back of your, food packaging, because we can just do this linear algebraic math problem and calculate how much we're supposed to weigh, air quotes, and then manage these numbers, and we can control our size. Okay, this is literally how all those weight loss apps work. It is based on a linear algebraic equation. All right, and if you believe the human body is as simple as a first order linear algebraic equation that your sixth grader knows how to solve, you are seriously underestimating the human body. All right, so, but it seems simple. Like, it seems like it should be right. This whole calories in, calories out thing seems like it should make sense. Like, if I eat a 200 calorie cupcake and I go run 2 miles, which is 100 miles per calorie, then that should cancel out and be a net zero. Like, it feels right if we don't question it. And here's the problem. We haven't questioned it. And we repeat it. And we incorporate all these weird, convoluted, super dangerous, biased things into our science, and then we repeat them, and then we repeat them, and we repeat them to each other, and we repeat them wearing white coats. It's super complicated to discern good science, even at the source. Even if you're trained to do this and you're looking at a primary source, this is not easy, folks. And then, like I said, every level of communication is like a bad game of telephone, okay? So you've got people, somebody's got an idea in their brain. This is a human being who is biased, all right? Because we all are, like I said, including me. We all are biased to some degree. And then they come up with an idea. And then they're in a doctoral program, and they go to their mentor and they pitch the idea, and then they write a proposal to get funding, and then they do this, and then they conduct a study, but it has to be done there at their institution. And so there's bias upon bias upon bias. All right. Finally, they get a study. Then it gets published. Then it gets presented. Somehow it ends up in a textbook, in a classroom where a dietitian or a medical student or somebody is in class reading this textbook with a citation to the study. But we don't go back and read the study. And if we do, we certainly read the abstract and a conclusion, and we're not like doing a, investigative analysis of their research methods. We're just trying to get by. So we go from the person to the idea to the concept to the study subjects to the publication to the presentation to the textbook to the student. And then that student grows up to be a doctor, and at some point in the future is being interviewed by, 5 News at 5 and asked a question about, weight loss and getting your summer body back. And then they say something, then that becomes headline news because that's, being interpreted by a reporter. When then that gets forwarded on social media with a little caption from somebody who has nothing to do with anything. And you see what I'm saying? I'm being dramatic, but it's really not that dramatic to see how a tiny morsel of truth or bias, just goes through this whole amplification process and becomes essentially garbage by the end. All right. So, I don't want to be depressed about this, but I want you to know that I'm trying to train you to be a savvy consumer of information. We have all, for too long, taken somebody else's word for it, and it has to stop. It has to stop. And I really am talking specifically to people in the health professions. It has to stop. I mean, we have an ethical obligation to our practice to stop this. So, but anybody can do that. Anybody can just at least think. So next time you see, right now you're scrolling your social media, you're watching TV or whatever, and you see a commercial and it says, hey, take this pill. Look at all our folks. They dropped 10 dress sizes in 2 weeks. Just think, okay? Just think about all these things that I just went through with you, and know that there's more to it than what you're seeing on the surface. All right. I hope you enjoyed this explanation today. And like I said, season 3 of this podcast is coming. I've got a couple more episodes of season 2. And then at the end of the summer, after a short break, I'm going to come back with season 3. And it is going to dive in deep to this weight stigma, the bias in clinical practice, the healthism narrative, this wellness culture. This is my wheelhouse. This is my absolute specialty, and I love talking about it. I love teaching people. I love really advocating for transparency and clarity in the health sciences. I think we owe it to people. We have done enough damage. So I'm glad you joined me today. Keep your eyes peeled for my upcoming summer series, Talk with a Doc. It's going to be advertised first on my social media and to my email list. So grab one of my free resources at maggielandismd.com, and that will get you on my email list. And I'll talk to you soon. I look forward to this conversation and new podcast coming next Wednesday. Thanks for joining. Thank you so much for being here today. If you love what you've learned, follow me on social media at maggielandismd, and you'll never miss a thing. You can also check out my website at maggielandismd.com and sign up to be part of our community of eaters. Thanks again for stopping by. We'll talk again soon.